consider these international players to be external to the existing conflicts and problematic legacies in the region is no longer acceptable or even moral. The inconclusive investigation into the use of chemical weapons hitherto gives relevant parties a good reason to move forward with a political solution. That is, the lack of an incontrovertible evidence hitherto as to the source of the attack and the denials from all sides can be an opportunity to suspend judgment and compel a historic compromise, and this is what we are foregoing. But the will and readiness of to compromise by all actors involved must be led by the most powerful, for good reason this time. However, in the meantime, the outlook is quite bleak. Political actors that might play an effective role in mitigating this human tragedy are in short supply. To depend on a regime, the Syrian regime, that has oppressed Syrians for decades and wreaked havoc with the population even before the uprising became fully militarized and internationalized, is futile. To rely on the sense and sensibility of an opposition that is replete with opportunists, extremists, and often equally brutal elements is equally futile. And to rely on regional actors such as Qatar and Saudi Arabia that are too close and or too deeply involved in the Syrian crisis, not to mention that they are all in dire need of cleaning up their own human rights record of abuses, is also futile. Unfortunately for ordinary Syrians, the remaining option is what is called the international community, with its good, bad, and hypocritically ugly. Enough has been said about the severe double standards of the United States Middle East policy when it comes to supporting dictatorships in the region, from Saudi Arabia to Egypt, and egregious violators and supporting egregious violators of human rights and international law like Israel. In all likelihood, next to nothing can be expected from Russia and China, on the other hand, in relation to human rights, as the record in this regard leaves a lot to be desired, except that the United States has been regularly invading and bombing countries in the region since 2001. Well, 1991. But a configuration based on common interests can be possible, just as non-democrats can come together and compromise to create the kernel of a democratic process and polity as a result of self-interest. Countries like the United States and Russia can actually come together to produce a potential political solution that is the only way for ending this tragedy. It is in this context of a humanitarian tragedy and lack of political will and candidates and incredible candidates that we must address the folly of American bombing of Syria. For a variety of reasons, this potential strike is wrong-headed and potentially disastrous. Rania discussed a lot of these reasons. It's full of blind spots on the moral, political, and military levels. Even from an uncritical standpoint, it is simply counterproductive. It will suffice to discuss right now the issue of international and regional will on the one hand and the issue of effectiveness, and hopefully we can open the floor for more specific discussions. For good reasons, the UK and other powerful regional and international actors are either hesitant, skeptical, or opposed to the strike. This thin coalitional background should raise serious flags inside any American administration or hall of power, with many of its members directly funding the rebels, including Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Even the Arab League, which suspended Syria's membership and generally pushed for sanctions against the Syrian regime, failed to more than condemn the use of chemical weapons. They did not support a strike. Surely they recognize the volatility and perhaps futility of such a move, considering their geographic proximity. Therefore, this is not just a bad idea in principle, whoever the culprit. According to a logic of consequences, the prospects proceed from grim to tragic. On the question of effectiveness, it is important to ask this, and I think we don't ask this enough, because as people who live in the United States and are used to living in the United States and look to the world from the perspective of the United States, we're not used to asking this question, and that is, effective for whom? Which is a repetition of what happened in the case of Iraq. Did we do the right thing when we invade Iraq, or did we not do the right thing? Did we prepare properly or did we not prepare properly? The dissenters in the United States were emphasizing the fact that we did not prepare properly for invading Iraq in 2003, and that's why things went down south. But we are assuming that we have this right, which I said I will not talk about, so I'll stop here. Yeah, I couldn't help myself. So the question is, effective for whom? If we are concerned about the well-being of the Syrian people, then such a strike might bring more devastation to them on several counts. First, by President Obama's admission, the strike is going to be limited in scope, which means it will not alter the balance of power on the ground and will probably embolden all actors involved to ratchet up the violence and mayhem as the stakes rise. The United States apparently wants to do a bloody nose operation that doesn't actually alter the balance of power on the ground, and this is very important. It becomes almost like a gratuitous war, and that becomes even more problematic. And the United States gave Bashar Assad assurances that this would be limited in scope, which means they are sending a message saying, just withstand it so that we can go back to killing each other, or you guys can go back to killing each other, and don't do something stupid like allow it to overflow into other areas, or maybe respond with launching rockets on neighboring countries and so on and so forth. So the kind of cynicism that exists here is actually very special, and I think only the United States is capable of doing it. Clearly, too, a strike is not intended to deplete the stockpile of any existing chemical weapons, nor can it, considering various reports about such chemical agents either being smuggled in from Turkey or manufactured locally. And you don't actually bomb chemical weapons because it will create an epidemic that's of proportions that are orders of magnitude worse than what had happened. In fact, U.S. military intervention will create a precedent that can be abused by the opposition henceforth by crying wolf. Geographic and demographic factors also pose a challenge that is orders of magnitude more complicated than, for instance, the case of NATO intervention in Libya, which was bad enough. The potential slap on the face then can be inordinately costly and tragic. Finally, one need not listen to the proclamations of Syrian President Bashar Assad in a recent interview to realize that such a strike can have volatile regional effects by bringing new players into the conflict. This potential spillover will be a detriment, which is what the United States is trying to avoid, will be a detriment to the Syrian people first and foremost. With tensions running high between Israel and Iran, vendettas from the 2006 war lurking in the Israeli decision-makers' psyche and proclamations and op-eds, longer-range missiles acquired by Hezbollah in the past few years to go along, and the coterie of takfiri or jihadist groups looking for mayhem so they can make their mark from Lebanon to Syria to Iraq and beyond. Such an assault is undeniably irresponsible and foolish. It is not inconceivable that the existing regional tension, political or sectarian, might be the host for an entirely new context that can be set off by an operation or bombing gone wrong. This is not to sound unnecessarily alarmist. Many have a tendency to jettison that what's on the table is a military strike against a sovereign nation amid a sea of hostility and firepower. Considering the opportunity cost of such an aggression, the impending strike appears increasingly disastrous. I could talk a little bit about the various players or summary of players in Syria, or we could go to Q&A. Would it help to just throw out the few basic players and discuss them?
Yes.
I have 7 minutes left.
Actually, do people want to come in? There's empty chairs up here. And that for using your
I think now you wanted to leave, but now you're very Guys. Just a very quick summary of, a very crude summary, in fact, of what's happening in Syria in terms of the players involved. First, we have the regime, which is a very important element of this entire situation. And what's important about this element is that it is not like the Egyptian or the Tunisian regimes. It is actually a regime that is extremely cohesive and coherent and is quite organic to itself. In other words, there is no possibility in the Syrian situation of any institution within the state to develop any kind of autonomy, or another word that I will not use here, to develop the courage to actually step up and say to the presidency or to the president or to the political elite at the very top, to step up and say, look, just like Hosni Mubarak and Zain Abidin left the country to preserve the regime and preserve mayhem, you need to do so and we'll take over. This is not possible because this autonomy has never existed within any institution within the Syrian regime historically and today. So that cohesiveness is what creates a zero-sum game between state and opposition in Syria as a result largely of the idea that there is no possibility of schism at the top. The other sides of the opposition, of course, the other side of the spectrum include the regime opposition. But first, let me say a couple words about who the regime supporters are. The regime supporters are divided into a varied groups. The regime supporters are not simply a set of groups that has been static since the beginning of the uprising. In fact, in the very beginning, not the first month or so, but early on, in the first year, there was a potential of a huge number of people to move away from the regime and support not necessarily the opposition, but oppose the regime. And that movement began to happen in about May or June of 2011. It continued to happen until the opposition and the uprising became militarized, and that's when people hit pause on their movement from regime to anti-regime, if not to pro-opposition. So it's important to recognize that these groups that I'll be discussing have actually had a change of heart. Not that they became regime lovers, but they became increasingly skeptical about the uprising, even though they support an uprising that has the kind of principles that started the uprising among certain groups at least. So on the one hand, the regime supporters, in a sort of a summed up way, are the majority of all minorities. Not all minorities, not all Christian or Alawis and all Ismailis and all Shi'is and all Druze support the regime because they are minorities in Syria, considering that the majority is Sunni. But the majority of minorities support the status quo. I'm not going to say the regime, which means they do not want a change, especially as the opposition and as the uprising has become extremely unpredictable and extremist and so on and so forth in many of its parts. I disagree with people who say that the entire opposition or the entire uprising has actually become X. There's no such thing. But the strongest elements within the opposition, at least militarily, have gone in this direction. The other part that supports the state or the regime or the status quo are people that have been beneficiaries of the regime all along, including Sunnis and including the majoritarian sect that exists in Syria. So it's not just a minoritarian thing. These beneficiaries have assets and interests that are deeply intertwined with the regime. And even though it's a small number of groups, these are not millions of people, they are extremely influential, extremely powerful, locally and regionally and some internationally. The third group are the upper middle class. The upper middle class, of course, is split, but because of the militarization and radicalization of the opposition and of the uprising, they basically started moving away from the opposition. And when you are not supporting the opposite of the status quo, in other words, when you are applying the lesser evil argument, you are unintentionally supporting the status quo, whether you support the regime or not. So that is also giving the regime more credence. In other words, only in Syria, I keep saying, only in Syria can an opposition screw up an uprising against a 40 or 50-year-old dictatorship, and it's really, it takes a lot of art to do that. And finally, the opposition. The opposition is divided into internal and external opposition. The external opposition, for the most part, does not have credibility, even in its various incarnations. but parts of it actually that are not in line with the majority of the opposition outside Syria, those parts are actually have some legitimacy in the eyes of many Syrians because they oppose both the regime and they oppose any kind of international or regional intervention a la Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, the United States. So, however, these guys are, and gals are a small group, the external, what I might call decent opposition. The rest of the opposition has basically mortgaged its autonomy, has mortgaged its autonomy to those to their patrons, and that is why the opposition could not come together externally and achieve any form of collective action within itself, let alone mobilize people inside Syria to achieve collective action with it. Finally, the internal opposition is divided into various groups. The three most important groups are the Free Syrian Army, which is an amalgam of various factions that are not necessarily under one command. The FSA is kind of like in structure, not ideology, is like Al-Qaeda, in the sense that anybody who's fighting the Syrian regime would say, I'm FSA. And it gives the impression that there is a lot of FSA. And in this case, in the other case, that there's a lot of Al-Qaeda, but there isn't really on either side. There's no central control. And then you have the radical Islamic groups. I don't like the word jihadist, I like the word takfiris for various reasons. These are groups that actually are exclusionary in many ways, and they exclude other Muslims, not just other non-Muslims, and they exclude other Islamists. For instance, they don't like the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria and other Islamists because they feel that they don't go far enough. The point is that this group actually is not as large as people think. It is, some people say 10%, 15%, some people say as high as 20%. I think the truth is somewhere in between. They are effective because they spearhead the military campaign. They spearhead the military campaign not because they have the most fighters, but because, in fact, they are quite courageous for whatever reason. They are actually the ones who have attacked and taken some of these barracks and stations inside the regime strongholds. When this used to happen, it stopped happening after December, January of 2003. It stopped happening as much for various reasons. And then finally, the local coordinating committees. These are the committees of mostly civilian people who have been marginalized by the militarization of the opposition. And in my view, they represent the largest portion of the opposition that is still in opposition, but is actually equally wary of the other parts of the opposition and has developed a resistance to the Jabhat al-Nusra-like opposition by opposing some of these plans that Jabhat al-Nusra and other radical Islamic groups have in terms of creating small Islamic emirates and establishing the Sharia within those territories. There's been a serious wave of opposition to the opposition. And that is exactly where I need to stop because I was going to stop, and this is exactly where I was going to stop anyway. And this split is, I think, important to recognize in discussing this conflict. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. There's a few more chairs up here if folks want to fill in, unless you're happy hanging out in the back. I guess we're all happy too. So we've got a bunch of time for questions. We have a few questions that kind of came from the organizers. I wanted to ask these folks. I might intersperse some of the pre-thought through questions with some of your questions. Is that okay? So you can just raise your hands and I'll write stuff down and try and take staff as well as I can. And we'll get through as many as we can. So we have one. Oh gosh. Let's start with one, two, and we'll see how many we get through.
This documentary, Terrorist and Terrorist, that was great. I'd like to raise 2 points that amazingly one of you did. The first one is about being against military action in Syria. A lot of the conversation and the debate in Congress has been about whether we're going to have boots on the ground. And so they're looking at this purely from a selfish perspective of like, well, we don't want to get entangled. But I would like to say, even if this was a strike, which what Kerry is proposing, and if you talk to him and if you raise the question of boots on the ground, you're going to get it back, oh, we're not going to have it, we're just going to have this narrow strike. Even if they do what they propose to do, which is stay in their ships and launch cruise missiles. They are not going to send planes out that are going to get shot down. They're going to send cruise missiles. They're going to be out of range of Syrian military hardware. Even if that is all they do, I'm against it. The second point, for reasons cited. The second point, and I would like to go farther. In fact, I would like to defend the regime to a certain extent. Everyone, and I'm glad you pointed out The Guardian and Glenn Greenwald, and you can add to that Amy Goodman, and all your left, supposedly progressive people, they start with this baseline of saying the brutal Syrian regime. Okay, fine. There have been brutalities. I don't know about all the brutalities. I don't know everything they've done. I know in this conflict, the first thing I became aware of was some children, young boys, who supposedly were tortured and abused, taken by the Syrian army. Is President Assad responsible for that? We had Sergeant Bales in Afghanistan go haywire and kill a bunch of people. Is President Obama personally responsible for that? There probably over the years have been a lot of tortures in Syria, a lot of arrests for political reasons. We have that here. If you were black in this country, if you were subject to stop and frisk, if you were Amadou Diallo, or the other gentleman a few years before that in New York, I can't remember his name, although I looked it up today, but all you need to do is look up sodomized with a plunger, New York City.
Abner Luino.
Right. You would realize that anytime you want to talk about the brutal Syrian regime, you should couple that with the brutal American regime, to be fair, unless anybody can point this out. And the other people just say, oh, his family. So they hold Bashar responsible for everything his father had done for the past 30 years. And no mention is made of this attempt, however imperfect or insincere it may have been, that in 2011 we did have an election. So that is what I would. I'd also like to say on the organizing thing, I'm working with a group called United Front Against Austerity. There's not much small people can do, but we're concentrating on undecided votes in the Congress. We are phone calling, we are sending letters, we have a Twitter army.
So, would it be okay if I did like a really quick, what's called a straw poll? That was very technical. Thank you for sharing. I guess I want to know, we're going to have time for breakouts in a few minutes. Do you all want to take this time right now to just be asking questions for these folks, or do you want to be having this back and forth? So this is like a really quick poll, and as a facilitator, I'll know a little bit better if I should be steering folks a little bit more towards questions or more of a sharing of opinion. So if you're interested in having people for the next 20, 30 minutes or so, mostly just asking questions to these folks, can you just put your hand in the air?
Wait, how much time do we have overall?
We have until about 9:15, and we're going to have about half an hour at the end for breakouts. Right now it's a little less than 8. Do people want it, or so raise your hand if you would like to have this next half hour or so, more people sharing opinions. Great. So I'll try and keep you all to ask your questions, but thank you for affirming me as a facilitator. Great. So anyone have really specific, direct questions for our two guests? And what items of the
Yeah. So thank you very much. I think it's really helpful for me to get a lot more detail. I know that we studied it for years, but all the players, because it gets very complex. And Ronnie was so helpful with the training pieces. I think that's what my question is those two. So looking at the motivations, and you look at money and the money trail, and we didn't talk a lot about economic motivations, but also kind of a bigger picture. My understanding for years has been this whole kind of U.S. plan, and again, wherever that's coming from, which elites, which industrial complex, et cetera, who knows, but the whole Sunni Shia split. So as we see more and more in the Middle East, it's moving toward creating situations where internally the Arabs, and then also the Persians now, and also the Afghanis and Pakistans. There's a Sunni Shia split, and they're becoming more and more split and attacking each other, and creating vacuums of crisis and places for war and conflict, etc. So you mentioned that Hezbollah, we can talk about Hezbollah, but Lebanon and Hezbollah, Syria and Iran are going to be part of that. I think Iran's probably the latest things, but you could talk a little bit about that. And then also the economy. So part of what I'm hearing is the natural gas pipeline that's being created with Iraq, Syria, Turkey, but also into Iran, and that may be the Gulf, and others are trying to disrupt that. But also the fact that the Gulf, Arabs, as we know, will come out really far ahead of the oil prices. If the war starts at Iran, lots of the Persian Gulf, etc. What's not making sense to me then is the economic powers of the West and why Europe and the U.S. and others would want to create a situation which actually leads to world recession again, if not depression, at this point. And I know that's been 20, but just a little bit more about that as well.
Well, there's two questions. So Sunni-Shia split, kind of a regional picture, and then also how it's related to oil and money and what's actually our interest in Syria.
Questions I can answer, I'll leave the rest of us I want to make a statement about boots on the ground, and I think it's really important when we're talking to our congressional representatives to speak the language that they understand. We know when we visit Congress, there's no way we can get them to suddenly see the light and become true to whatever ideology we personally believe in. So I'm a fan that when we talk to Congress, to actually speak the language that they themselves understand. And one comment that several representatives have stated, including my own former representative of North Carolina, is that they don't want boots on the ground. And Kerry, and I think it's important to quote this, Kerry has specifically said, when it comes to boots on the ground, is that there will be, quote, no boots on the ground with respect to the Civil War. Something else happened. So there's no exclusive rejection for boots on the ground. And the mere fact that an American plane does get down somehow, there will be boots on the ground. And I'm not referring to the dead boots of the ground of that pilot, but the additional boots on the ground to remove the POW. So that aspect is important to recognize, that has not been completely removed off the table. And if we're talking about a 60 to 90 day bombing campaign, the idea that there won't be boots on the ground is kind of problematic. If we consider JSOC to be boots on the ground, then we've already had boots on the ground. If we consider the CIA to be boots on the ground, then we've already had boots on the ground. So we also, and this can be important when we talk to Congress, how do we define boots? Whose boots are important? I'm just using the language that they're using. One other comment, I actually think it's detrimental to argue that just because our government has committed human rights violations and has condoned torture, that thereby that excuses the brutality of another regime. So I don't want to get into which regime has been more brutal or which regime has had a worse track record. To me, not only
raise which regimes use chemical weapons.
well, right. I mean, and I've stated that the United States government has funded it, used it, and has been, I would argue, the most grotesque and the greatest purveyor
Yes,
of
but by your
violence.
law, I think you should mention that.
Just did.
No, I mean, I stated it earlier. I think it's important for us just to because it's important for us to raise it in terms of the credibility issue. But speaking not only as an American, but as a person of the region that we're talking about, from an organizational perspective and from a solidarity perspective, I think it puts us in a great deal of difficulty if we try to excuse the crimes committed by others because our representatives have committed greater crimes. And we don't need to get into that. We are guilty, they are guilty, we're all guilty. And I do regard congressional representatives to be responsible for crimes committed in their district. That's my opinion. The Sunni Shia thing has been quite interesting. I mean, President Obama, I love it how he's now a historian. So not only is he the worst constitutional lawyer this country has known, but he's also now a historian because he went on record in one of his statements as saying that there is, quote, ancient sectarianism in the region. And I'm like, what the? This whole framing of Sunni Shia is another artificial frame imposed on the region that I would argue has become popularized in the past 10 to 15 years. It is ahistoric to the Eastern Mediterranean region, and completely ahistoric, and so we need to be wiser when we fall into that. Now it has increased, but that's because it's easy to